And you take it so very far with so many invented artists and institutions that one of the things I find myself wondering, Peter, is do you lose track of their stories? How do you keep track of who's where and what they've done and which art belongs to whom? It seems almost as though you'd need an entire archive an archivist to keep track of everything at this point, because there's several interconnecting novels worth of material here.
Yes, yeah, no, that's exactly right. And the idea of sort of internal contradictions and the way things can change. But I've almost got to the stage where I welcome that, and one character can go from being 5 foot tall to 6.5 feet tall, and can change gender. And but even when I was still working as a painter and not focusing on creating fictitious art, I changed the names of my paintings either after they were sold or after they were exhibited. So I see it all as being quite flexible, and a lot of it's to do with reducing stress as well. So setting up a meeting like this is quite stressful, getting everything right and making sure the internet's working and things like that. So when I started setting up fictitious art fair booths, I decided I'd install them in museums and galleries as if, and I'd love to curate an exhibition called As If, but I'd set them up as if it was the press view of an art fair. And in 1989, especially the great year of revolutions and the year of the art fair murders, I went to a lot of different art fairs in Los Angeles, Chicago, Basel, Venice, London, and you turn up at the press view, because I was there as either having a stand at the art fair for my magazine or writing about the art fair. And during the press view, some of the stands were completely set up with those Sean Scully paintings and Giacometti's or whatever. And they'd opened the champagne and they were relaxing. And other booths, they had a tiger shark held at customs that hadn't been delivered, so there was still an empty booth. And then at other stands, there were ladders, and the wall text hadn't been put on the walls. So I incorporate that. It takes the stress off a museum show when it has to look unfinished, so you're not panicking to get the whole thing done. But I'll sometimes have a fictitious art fair booth where I get 2 people in white overalls actually putting the text onto the wall, so it becomes a bit like a performance, and people love standing around and watching that happen and so forth.
Yeah.
So,
Peter, the staging quality is really evident in the Art Fair Murders project, and one of the things that struck me about it, looking at the photographs as someone who's never seen the installations, but I'm thinking about this, is that the staging of the corpses looks very obviously fake. So I'm thinking, oh yes, there's the deception that's being pulled off on me. But those paintings in the back are real. It's as though you give us a decoy fakery where we think we spot the fakery, and then we don't spot the other fakery, which is you being the curator, or you being the art installers, or you being the vandals, you doing all these other things. I might be misunderstanding this, but there's so many layers of deception and quasi-deception in the Art Fair Murders. I'm interested in did you feel that the corpse and police line stuff was meant to be convincing, or was it more like it was meant to be a teaser for the other stuff around it?
Yes, more like a teaser for what's around it, I'd say, and that would be paralleled with the say the early press releases, where I'd in English, I deliberately put in very bad puns or facts that should be unrecognizable to or recognizable to someone who had English as a first language, but I didn't realize when it went to Italy or Germany or Japan that they would miss the very bad puns and think that it was real. And in a sense, the staged element of the art fair is, as you describe it, looking quite amateur in many ways. And of the different art terms that I use, heroic amateurism is one of them. So that it maybe fits in with that sort of idea. If I could quickly just return to Res Ingold with his airline, because by the time I met him, he was the first other person I'd met doing something similar and using logos and spot color and a total fantasy world, if you like. But one artist led to another, then led to another, and so forth. So Res Ingold said to me, have you heard of Servas with his fictitious world of deep sea herring fishing? And I said, no. And he said, oh, you can find him in Amsterdam. He shows at Torch Gallery, where I show. So I went to Amsterdam and I met Servas, who, and his spot color was orange because of the Dutch Royal House of Orange. So it was black, white, and orange. And I've seen him at the Basel Art Fair, sort of surrounded by billionaires, and he's dressed as a herring fisherman and smelling of herring and sitting behind a desk or table. But Servas then said to me, do you know about Seymour Likely? And I said, no, I've never heard of them. And he said, oh, they're a group of crazy artists, three guys who have taken on the identity of a fictitious American artist called Seymour Likely. One artist called Seymour Likely, but they ran the Seymour Likely bar, which was halfway between the red light district and the Royal Palace in Amsterdam. So I went along there and met them, and they'd actually gone to Amsterdam's main brewery, I think it was Heineken, and said, we're artists. They dressed up in suits and ties and said, we're artists and we'd like to run a bar as an artwork. So, and this predates relational aesthetics in many ways. And so to their credit, Heineken said, yes, we'll give you this small bar that we've got. So they hung their own artworks in it. And they also showed at Torch Gallery, which is I think the main gallery that's been showing this work for the longest. And then Seymour Likely led on to someone else. And one of the very first exhibitions, which had, I think, Seymour Likely, Res Ingold, and Servas in it, was called Business Art Business at the Groningen Museum in Holland. And that was about 91, I think. It was really early. And there was about 10 different artists creating different fictional worlds. And the catalogue was beautiful. It was a pizza box. And then you opened the pizza box and there were 10 very different catalogues, all designed differently inside the pizza box. But Seymour Likely did a whole range of projects, like it was a bit like Cindy Sherman for a slacker generation. They made their own movies and took the leading roles in the movies, but they only produced a film poster on a very large scale. So, and the posters were beautifully designed with, they'd be standing there with machine guns and there'd be text along the bottom about who all the actors were and so forth. So,
that's very interesting too, because it harkens to the later era of alternate reality games, which also often used posters as part of their advertising element. Peter, we've touched on or a little bit on this question. You brought up camouflage, and obviously misdirection and deception are central activities of this kind of work. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as the ethical questions that this raises for artists in relation to their public, and whether you see the problem there that some people do, and also that causes anger in some audience members when they end up feeling they've been deceived and tricked.
Yes, no, and I'll just preface that, and please remind me to come back to that specific point. But I like the idea that the same object can be either camouflaged or can be a work of display, as in animal behaviorism. So if you imagine Res Ingol's airline at the Cologne Art Fair, it's like a form of display that you've got acres and acres of art booths and artworks, and then you've got what looks like a travel agency with airlines and posters and so forth. So it really stands out like display. But if you were to put it, as I think Res Ingol did once, inside a real airfare, it's camouflaged, it disappears because it's surrounded by 1,000 other booths with airlines in it. So the actual booth may not change, but the context that you see it in is totally different. Now that was leading up to your point, Antoinette, about
the general ethics of using deception as a major strategy. Do you consider always justifiable, sometimes justifiable as an aesthetic, but not otherwise? I mean, how do you think about it?
Yes. Well, I guess for me, that comes back to when I started giving lectures, and I call them performance lectures. Sometimes there is a performative element, like from the Museum of Modern Art in Oxford. I got kidnapped from behind the lectern when I was giving the lecture and dragged into a car and flown to Heathrow Airport and then flew to Stockholm. But that was that broke out of the closed paradigm into a broader, more open paradigm. But in 1990, I started giving lectures about the Museum of Contemporary Ideas. And when I got to Sydney, I was at what was then called COFA at the University of New South Wales, the College of Fine Art. And Nick Waterlow, who became a very good friend, he suggested to me, he said, why not pretend that you're here from New York promoting the Museum of Contemporary Ideas, and I'll introduce you as the assistant press officer, which was the very modest role I took on, so I didn't even appear on the letterheading of the press releases and so forth. So he introduced me, and I gave the whole lecture as if I'd flown in from New York and was slightly jet lagged and living in a different season and so forth. And I repeated that at many other venues, and I found that very often often art historians and theorists, walked out halfway through quite angry with it. And so I thought about it for a while, and with the Herman Nietzsche shower curtain that you mentioned earlier, which is a fairly extreme example of fictitious artwork, if you like, I started constructing the lectures so that in the middle of the lecture, I'd show the Herman Nietzsche shower curtain, and then I'd say to the audience, well, probably by now you realize something is wrong, and the Museum of Contemporary Ideas doesn't exist, but it's my own artwork, if you like. And that changed the whole dynamic. You know, the audience enjoyed it, and often at the end of the audience, I'd say to them, would you have preferred if I hadn't told you it was a fiction? And they all said no. It gave them the opportunity to be sort of sucked in originally by the fiction or seduced by it, and then in the latter half, I could talk about it being an artwork and why I was doing this, and so forth. So that's the way I've continued to do it ever since.
I like that you take it all the way to the final conversation within the lectures. But even when artists are careful about how much they camouflage or how they out it, the work, it still can be often tagged as and dismissed as a hoax or a prank, and therefore can be seen as something that's fundamentally silly and not something that serious artists would really have any truck with. But I have heard you say that you see this work as a possible response to cultural trauma, and that's really evident in the work of at least some of the artists that you're, Stickleback, for example. But I'd be interested to hear you expand a little bit on what it is about this work that saves it from being just a prank, just a hoax.
Yes, I think I'm sort of interested in the whole spectrum, and I see at one extreme, which might be 5%, is the hoax, and then there's 95% that comes up to 100%, and at the top 10% maybe relates to the philosophy of science and ideas of falsificationism and verificationism and so forth. And then across the whole spectrum, there's different layers. And as someone who still works as an art writer for different magazines, and every year I try and write for 2 magazines or newspapers that I've never written for before, so that over 40 years I've probably written for about 100 different editors. And I quite like the game playing of having to pitch your review to a certain house style, whether it's the Financial Times or Art North in Scotland. They're all totally different. And for me, that's a bit like doing a crossword puzzle. It's a bit of game playing. And we might get to Ralph Rumney and the Situationists and Ralph's ideas from back in 1957 about the importance of game playing. If I could, I'd be quite happy.
I love how you've dragged in game playing, Peter. I think that's really important. Sort of strategic role playing, gameplay as part of our social lives already.
Yes. Yes.
So I have to say, I'm dying to ask you. We're almost out of time, so I wanted to sneak in one more question before we went to Q&A.
Yes.
I'm dying to hear more about this book you mentioned, where you want to actually tell people or teach people or guide people in making superfictions themselves. Can you talk a little bit about what you have in mind for that book?
Yes, no, delighted. I mean, until your wonderful book came along, and I must say, if I was being banished to a desert island and I could only take one book with me, I'd struggle to decide between your book, Sting in the Tail, and Laurie Waxman's book, Keep Walking Intently, about the ambulatory art of the surrealist, the situationist, international, and Fluxus. Ideally, if I could take both those books, I'd feel quite at home. I'm just trying to think. Just remind me of the...
What do people need to know about making superfictions that you would put into a book?
Yes. Well, my idea was to build a kind of a studio-based manual, if you like, that was called How to Build Your Own Superfiction. I don't know if you can see that there. And for a long time, I've been giving workshops at art schools in Singapore and Scotland and America and elsewhere on how to build your own superfiction. And on the front of the card, I have different superfiction artists, real artists, and on the reverse is different prompts to the students, and the students may be from first year through to PhD, but I'll just read 2 or 3 of them out. Create your own fictional art school, no fees, no exams, 24-hour access, global connections, perhaps a little bit like BHQFU in New York, which I visited a few years ago, or make a fictional business, an airline, a bank, a hotel, a cosmetics company, a driving school, or describe a new art movement, write your own manifesto, become a heroic amateur, and but there's 10 of them altogether. One is learn something new. So a lot of these exercises are to break the habit that art students get into of doing the same thing again and again, and possibly getting better at it again and again, but not experimenting as much as they did perhaps in first year. So learn something new, Mandarin, archery, astrophysics. And I recommend read The Glass Bead Game, set in the 25th century by Hermann Hesse. And that was a huge influence on me back in my lighthouse days. And I tried to read it again recently, and I thought it was really turgid. So, but at the time, I thought it was brilliant. And the idea that the glass bead game is such a complex game that in order to make a single move, you might have to go and learn Zen archery and come back 2 years later and make your move. And then you go and learn ceramics and come back. And it becomes this, the most complex game in the world.
And all of it can feed future fictive art projects as well. Peter, I wanted to see if there were any questions for you from our attendees. Gordy or Carrie, who's got some questions for us?
Well, actually, I have one. Can you hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And you can't see me, but now you can. Well, yes. I'm just kind of curious, Peter. I noticed in your art fair murders, the top hat, faceless character with the mask. What was the influence of that character?
Yes, well, supposedly that's my character, Stickleback, who we've mentioned before, and he's a little bit like Banksy. If he is a he not necessarily, but nobody knows exactly who he is. And sometimes I play the role myself. And in the image that we saw earlier, that was a Melbourne artist, a very good artist called Kerry Han, wearing the top hat. And I positioned him within the installation. So I haven't really developed his backstory completely yet, but I have written a novel that's got Stickleback in it that's partly set in Glasgow, partly in Berlin, and in the outback of Australia.
Well, I saw that image. I immediately thought of Fantomos, so I was wondering if that was an influence in any way. The great French evil mastermind. So, yes. Well,
Yes.
in any time in history, now is the time for fictive art. And are you looking at maybe other social media platforms to engage with?
Yes, I've certainly got an Instagram presence that I haven't really divided out between sort of personal Instagrams and superfiction Instagrams, but every so often I go in and I archive all the personal ones so that all that's left are superfictions. So Superfictions 1 is the Instagram account, and it's got all of Stickleback's work on it. But
Great.
You'll see a lot of other stuff there just now. In the next day or two, I'll take out all the irrelevant stuff.
Well, with journalism imploding, we're seeing so many different platforms that are arriving that are basically new formats for a journalist to ply their trade without a newspaper behind them. And that's certainly ripe for fictive art.
Yes. And also the world of non-fungible transactions and so forth. That,
Boy, that's a universe
in the last year. Yeah. And, we've Antoinette has mentioned Hauser and Worth's archaeological show, which I saw at the Frieze Art Fair in London, and a few months later, Damien Hirst in Venice.
Oh,
and
right.
Of course, all of these artists are getting into non-fungible stuff at the moment.
Right.
Which I could do. I've never had a great desire to make a lot of money, so I'm not motivated by going in that direction, but perhaps I could.
You're already a billionaire, right? So you don't have to worry about money.
Oh, that's right. I'm very lucky.
Yeah.
Peter, there's a lovely question here from Beauvais Lions about whether there were specific elements in your own education that made it helped you become a fictive artist or slowed you down? But particularly, is there anything that in your education that pointed you in this direction?
That's a really good question. Thank you very much. I mean, briefly, I could say my father was a zoologist, and his father was an artist. And from a very early age, I always thought that I might become, either a scientist who had art as a hobby, as my father did, or I might become an artist with science as a hobby, which is what I've tried to do. Much later in my teenage years, when I had decided to study art at school, that I heard about the idea of the Renaissance person, and that one person could be involved in a whole range of intellectual and emotional activities. And I was sort of very much attracted towards that. And yes, I think they would be the main influences, but I could see superfictions expanding into being a kind of alternative type of university where at the center of it, you had a mixture of people who were absolute specialists in their own field, combined with another group who were absolute generalists. And between the two of them interacting together, you could produce a quite interesting faculty.
I just love that comment you made about just the fact that someone can really research something and fantasize about that. I can never own an airline, but God, I'd like to think about that and all those possibilities. It's an interesting approach to the arts, I think, and I think it might inspire a lot of people in brand new ways. I like that.
Oh, thank you. Yes, no, I mean, I think it can be, hopefully for students or candidates or artists, as I prefer to think of them, sort of inspiring and make them work in ways they never worked in before. I mean, I remember having a student once at art school somewhere, and they said to me, I haven't had a life like Joseph Beuys. I haven't been shot down in a German fighter plane and wrapped in fat and felt and rehabilitated and made artwork for the rest of my life about that. And then, I said, well, why not invent it? Pretend you've been on a plane that's crashed in Hawaii or perhaps a uninhabited Pacific island, and all you've got is boot polish and cheese, and that's all you can make artworks out of. So I think there's ways around these problems.
I like it. Now, Carrie Patterson has a question for us. She says, Peter, I love that you suggest people try something new as a way to create superfictions, a version of the beginner mind. Just a comment, unless you would like to comment on the general wisdom of that.
Yes, no, that's a great comment. And I think it's almost a guiding principle, certainly behind my superfiction workshops, that, if you've been learning to paint in oil paint or acrylics for years, then why not spend just 1 week on this project? Or some of these superfiction workshops, they always last for at least half a day. Some last for a week. And I did one at Deakin University that became a whole semester, a whole term of superfictions. And, maybe the student at the end of it goes back to using oil paint and acrylic, but possibly in a different way. Or maybe they move on. Philip Guston, I've always loved his work, but I've also loved it too for the way he changed styles so dramatically from the early surrealist paintings through to the abstract expressionism, and then the very great late period Guston paintings. And he was totally ridiculed in his final phase, and all the dealers in America dropped him, and the collectors started selling off their work. But he he produced some of the best work, I think, of the 20th century.
We have
I
a
think
follow-up question from Beauvais.
Yes?
Go ahead, Beauvais.
Actually, I think it was Heather Jessup wanted to ask the question.
They're both in the queue as far as I can tell.
I think Beauvais was ahead of me, but now appears frozen on my screen.
Yes, I think
You
he's
may have to
muted.
come back in.
Go ahead, Heather.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Hello, Heather.
Hi, Peter, lovely to see you.
Great to
Thanks
see
so
you
much
too.
for all of this. Yeah, Gordon and Carrie, it's such a great conversation. I'm curious about play and childhood and imagination in relationship to some of your characters. And I feel like what's so kind of like fascinating about the proliferation of your heteronyms is the way that they sort of like go against the seriousness of the art world or the seriousness of capitalism in the art world. And I feel like a lot of art, a lot of artists start as sort of a novelist, in the case of you with your memoirs, but start with very heady imaginations and often lonely childhoods, and that playfulness gets kind of like weeded out of them the more professionalized they become. So I'm curious about play and make believe and the sort of like childhood sense of characters, imaginary friends and that sort of thing. And I'm wondering if that resonates with you personally, or if that's part of what you see sort of being the magic of superfictions in some ways, is bringing that into a capitalized adult sort of world, I suppose, of art.
Yes, no, that's a brilliant question, and I'm just trying to think where to start. I mean, the big influence on play with me is Ralph Rumney, again, the and was later expelled by Guy Debord for getting his psychogeographical report on Venice in late. And but back in 1957, he was saying that cities should be built around the infrastructure should be built around ideas of play. And I met him in London in '89, and we became very good friends and went on many derives around London and Edinburgh and other places. And his whole life was a kind of game playing. He was married to Pegeen Guggenheim, daughter of Peggy Guggenheim, and Pegeen sadly committed suicide, and Peggy tried to get Ralph charged with murder in Venice, so he fled from Venice and went to Paris. And Peggy Guggenheim had put private detectives, trailing him through the city. And again, Laurie Waxman sort of describes this brilliantly in her book, but he realized he was being followed by detectives, so he turned it into a game, and he would walk for hours and hours around Paris, and these poor detectives were following him, and he'd climb over walls. And so there's certainly, with the idea of the derive and psychogeography, there's a very strong element of play about it, but I'd also link it to the other idea I've got about adventurism, where it's like you create an artwork which also becomes something of an adventure. And those thoughts go back to me as a 20-year-old on the lighthouses, where I realized you could be both a nomad and a hermit at the same time. We tend to think of them as opposite extremes. And I remember hearing of a couple of lighthouse keepers, young men who you worked a month on and a month off on the lighthouse throughout the year. And in their month off, they would fly to America and hire a couple of Harley Davidsons and drive across Route 66 and then come back to Scotland and become hermits again for the next month on the island. And I rather like that idea that the same person can have possibly more than one life through fiction, but certainly they can inhabit two extremes of being the nomad and the hermit. So the last 4 years till COVID came, I was a nomad, going from Berlin to London to Bali and so forth. And then in the last year, I became a hermit with COVID, and Melbourne, close to where I am just now, has had the world's longest total lockdown of about 270 days. So we've all become used to being hermits, I think.
Do we have any more questions? Well, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. Pardon me, there's some police action outside, I guess. But I would like to thank all of you for joining us today. And Dr. Hill, that was absolutely amazing.
No, thank you.
I believe they caught him now. This is absolutely amazing. I just think it's very inspiring. And I think this is really a body of work for our time. Antoinette, you have hit the nail on the head. So congratulations with this book. We will be continuing this series. Publisher Carrie Patterson has created a series of dialogues with different artists from the book. So please join us on December 8th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. We'll be talking with Iris Hausler, and I hope I said that name correctly. I think we'll have a great discussion. And then again later on January 12th at also 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, we have another speech with the Beauvais Lions. So I think we've got a great program here. And again, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. Any other final questions, or maybe raise a hand before we cut out? Well, listen, again, thank you all so much. And we will meet again soon.
Thank
you
you,
all.
Gordy, and thank you so much, Peter. This was a real delight to listen to you at greater length.
Yeah, well, thank you for your wonderful book. That's terrific. And Carrie.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Gordy.
It was wonderful to be here.
Yeah. Okay. See you in the flesh soon.